All right. Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me well. Welcome to the Information Security Workshop for summer 2021. We have some great presentations lined up for you today, and we have various topics that will provide you guys, education, guidance, and some training in the cybersecurity arena. Still kind of early in the morning. I guess this is a summertime, and it's Monday. It's a lovely day outside. So I'm going to give a few more minutes for everyone to join. And once everyone is here, we will get started. So as you can see on the screen, we have a nice agenda for today. The first topic is going to be by me. You have to deal with me for 45-50 minutes. Hopefully, we just want to make sure that everybody remains muted and, out of respect, out of colleagues. That way there's no interruptions and, disturbance in that regards. So we allow usually the chat to be open like 15 minutes before the talk ends. I'm going to start my talk around 9:05. So the chat will open at 9:45. If anybody has any questions, they can ask really at their will. So the next talk is going to be at 10 o'clock will be by Mr. Stefan Heath, who's going to talk about the tour of dark web. That's a very interesting topic. Make sure you please attend. The other one after that is at 11 o'clock to 11:50 is open source intelligence by Omar. He's part of our security team. He's going to, talk about open source intelligence, how show some demos around those and tooling and techniques that can be, used. Then after that, we're going to have a quick lunch break for half an hour. And then we'll resume at 12:30. And then the talk is going to be by Dan Rojas on Windows Security Center. And once we finish with that, at 1:20 to 2 o'clock, we're going to talk about Azure AD security by Larry Suto. He has done a lot of research on that. We also have created a Windows Security Lab, which people can log in and practice their security. So we have compromised system where users can from colleges log in and brush up on their security skill set. After that, we're going to talk about some great tooling and techniques that you can do around ransomware prevention and response. So again, Larry has done a great research on that, and he would like to showcase what you can do to effectively defend against these ongoing ransomware attacks. Having said that, if Cindy, if you don't mind, and share your screen so I can share my screen. All right. All right, so hopefully everyone can see my screen. If not, please let me know or Cindy know so we can correct that. See. So everyone can see my screen, hopefully. Give me a second. I just want to confirm. All right. If they can, I'm ready to get started. Again, thank you very much for joining. Just make sure that everyone can see my screen. Thank you for confirming that, Mr. Sandoval. All right, so the first talk is going to be by me. Introduction, I'm the Information Security Officer at California Community College Tech Center. I've been around this position for a year or so. So it's been an interesting journey so far. And since then I joined, we have done some new things and faced with the new challenges, in terms of working remotely. As you can see, after the pandemic, our life has been impacted greatly in terms of work and cybersecurity threats, and and all sorts of the coronavirus situation and everything else. So I'm going to try to relate these things to how this is important. How does it relate to our personal life? And then I dive into how does it impact on your day-to-day business at community colleges and your life. So they go hand in hand. So in hold on a second. Sorry about that. Okay, why was 2020 a turning point for cybersecurity? As I mentioned, internet usage increased dramatically through the course of the global pandemic we are still in. Cyber attacks against the government organization and other infrastructure increased well. So as people work remotely, and there was ill preparedness in regards of terms of security, and the bad actors exploited that, and that sort of had a severe impact in cybersecurity threat landscape. More and more data is collected every day. Policies to protect the data is more urgent than ever. There's World Global Conference around this topic, and they did research, and they found there was a serious lack of preparedness in different organizations. So in order to address this, successful organization needs to create a strong culture of cyber hygiene, which I'm going to be talking about shortly. I try to make this presentation start with some of the professionals who have been in security field or seasoned professional. They already know some of those techniques and tools, but I just want to do a quick introduction for our new audience, who are new to this and may not understand everything. Why is it related to each other? Why is ransomware important? Why is security is important in general? So as you can see, California was the most targeted state by threat actors in 2020, and so the reason was California ranked just ahead of Texas in number of known ransomware attacks, according to cyber security dive tracker. The reason is California has the nation's largest population, and its economy is equivalent to 25 states combined. So this makes them very appealing for bad actors, right? And they want to take some advantage or exploit something as a result of that. Texas ranks, as you can see here, just a little bit, behind us in terms of ransomware attacks. So California and Texas employs about 2 million and 1 million tech workers respectively. So California has double the amount of tech workers compared to Texas. And it outpaces tech companies in New York, which is about 700,000 employees. So last year alone, for example, 20 municipalities in Texas were hit by in what's believed to be a connected ransomware attack. So it was very unusual to see this for a singular event. In Texas, as a matter of fact, declared a state of emergency for this. What needs to be protected in terms of information when it comes to colleges and the environment we are in? what is important? PII, which is personal information and sensitive data, confidential data, financial data, student records, and stuff like that. So, these are some of the things that one needs to protect, and which bad actors are after. Examples of PII, what that means for the new people who are new to security or want to understand what PII stand for, usually is name, gender, social security numbers, sexual orientation, date of birth, driver license, so things that can be used to steal your identity and compromise your data some way to exploit some sort of motivation is probably either sabotage or monetary gain. Could be a number of things that bad actors would be pursuing. So in general, most organization must practice a good cyber hygiene. What that means: a set of practices or that individual or the organization can take to protect their PII, which I just mentioned. So think about if you are if you don't want to get sick, so you want to take care of your health, and so you would eat well, exercise, avoid fatty food and stuff like that. So you're in a good, healthy shape. So if something happens that you're not impacted by that, by diseases and viruses, and your immunity towards that is better. So similarly, cyber hygiene is similar to that. So a personal hygiene can be related to cyber hygiene in terms of understanding why this is important. So the origin and the usage of cyber a hygiene concept or came from Wendt, who was in the early architect of the internet and the Google's chief internet evangelist, who says he came up with the idea when he was brushing his teeth. So I usually don't think about those type of things. I'm just worrying about my teeth, but he was thinking about hygiene, and where he considered that his own own hygiene can be applicable in understanding a cyber hygiene. So as you can see, every time there is an increase when there's some attacks, mass scale, people start getting interested in cyber hygiene, and there's in the Google or different search engines, people go and search for the concept of cyber hygiene because they want to know what's going on. So similarly, if there's a pandemic such as the coronavirus, people go and Google it, what's going on, how can they prevent it, how they can get vaccinated. So similar things, a similar concept applies to cyber hygiene. So if you have to conceptualize cyber hygiene, in terms of as a person or what you see in terms of health or well-being, think about germ theory. Accepted scientific theory for many diseases, microorganisms, and pathogens can lead to diseases and cannot be viewed with a naked eye. So some of the viruses we have cannot be seen naked eye. Similarly, people rarely see exploits or socially engineered cyber attacks until it's too late. You have something sitting in your email, you just accidentally click, by the time you do it, something already hit you. So we accept that germs can make us sick. We are willing to take precautions and to practice good hygiene on a daily basis to guard against them, such as washing hands, taking showers, taking medication, doing different type of thing, wearing a mask, stuff like that. In similar fashion, to keep digital viruses away, one would need to implement digital hygienic practices to protect both yourself and your company. So if you don't have any passwords or something like that in your system, you're going to be, under attack. So if you don't wash your hands and properly and clean yourself, you may get some germs. So this is a similar, systems work in a similar fashion if you want to simplify the understanding around that. Way to conceptualize practices in terms of health, but no clear standards. So, there's no clear definition or approach, but cyber hygiene should be viewed in the same manner as personal hygiene. So if you, if one gives the due care to cybersecurity as they would do to their personal health, we'll be in a different situation, I guess, I'm assuming. So, for example, the Department of Homeland Security has instituted CDM, which is continuous diagnostic and mitigation, that is built on the NIST framework with a hygiene score. So, that tells you where you are at in terms of hygiene. Cyber hygiene is the most important life skill that we can teach our children over the coming decade, because everything is going to be online education in health and everything else. So this is something, it's a life learning experience that everybody needs to, get started at an early age. The cyber, in terms of technical, hybrid refers to practice a system administrator and user make to improve integrity of personal information within the organization or their personal life during, so it's very, very important for you to take this seriously. Fighting infection in the 21st century is less about washing your hands and more about not clicking untrusted email attachment. So, you have to do certain things that you would do in order to, protect your, cyber well-being or personal well-being. Cybersecurity is cyber health. Why is this? What is the relation between cybersecurity, cyber health? Is, think of, poor habits, infection, and poor, unbalanced nutrition, lack of vaccination. They are very similar to how systems work. So if you have software or configuration that may include or use unreliable, obsolete components, and that can lead to some sort of a security attack or security misconfiguration, and next thing you know, your system is compromised. Poor habits. This is the indiscriminate use of unreliable website or software products or components, technology that can lead to infection or create a hole in the security. So as you can see, it's very conceptually, they're very related to each other. Infection is, if you think of an infection that you have, due to anything as a person, similarly in the system, vulnerability may not cause compromise, but can eventually result in one. So you have some infection, it grows up during time, it can become deadly. Unbalanced nutrition, poor in digestion of business processes and technological processes. So if you have poor processes for onboarding, offboarding, stuff like that, hiring and termination, those are some example of unbalanced sort of nutrition, you might say, when it comes to cybersecurity health. Lack of vaccination, protection against specific vulnerability and threats. Stressful working condition. The organization staff is so busy with the routine operation that they sacrifice safety-related activities. And the last one is chronic and acute pathology. Security incidents can be long and discomforting, fast and severe. So, as you can see, why these things are very, it's very easy to understand why cybersecurity is important. As if you think about, personal hygiene as it relates to a person's well-being. The common ways data is compromised these days. So I just want to talk briefly for the the folks who are new to security and they're trying to learn about basic things. And so, password theft. The other one is phishing, farming, and ransomware. If we do care of these type of things, then we will be in pretty good shape. So it's important to understand these concepts, why these compromises occur because of these, and what takes place in these areas. Password theft. So what is it? So password theft is basically a common way of ways that passwords are breached through GPU based on cracking tools and social engineering, including phishing. So what happens is basically the length and if your password length is not complex or long or is not long enough, attacker or bad actor can just basically take that, try to break that password and steal it and use it effectively. For example, Michael Linton, of former CEO of Sony, his password was Sony L3, I'm sorry, as his password, and the password for internal were stored in a and he stored this password in his password files. So they didn't, as you can see, that was a poor practice, and in the ZZ password that even somebody a cracking tool can easily break this password. Password theft. Passwords are not sometimes saved in as a plain text. Sometimes they are encrypted by hash. And as you can see, the hash is very long. So for example, if ABCD123 is your password, and the under MD5, your hash will be be a long hash. So make sure you have using proper hashes, not obsolete ones. Password thefts, so the hashes are again, obtained through exploiting a known vulnerability on a system, such as SQL injection, extracting the user database containing a password hashes. System that have LLMR or NBTNS enabled can be comprised through a tool such as Responder. So what is Responder? Responder is an open source tool used to poison, named surfaces to gather, hashes and credentials from the system within a local network. So it's a technique they use to, steal your passwords. They have other techniques, but just in order for simplification, it's just good to understand some basic concepts. Password theft. Once the hashes are obtained, password cracking tools used to check a pre-compiled list of passwords against available hashes of account. So how do these, how do people do this? So they have dictionaries and wordless attack, which uses a pre-compiled list of words, phrases, and common techniques, unique strings to attempt to match a password. What's the other technique? So they have brute force attack. So what they do is attempt every possible combination of a given character set, usually up to a certain length. So if your length is long, they're just going to give up. But if it's, if your password is short, they might be able to, break that. Rule attack, which basically generates premeditation against a given word list by modifying, trimming, and extending, expanding, or skipping words. So there are different techniques the bad actors use to steal your password. Password cracking tools. These are openly available, open source, and anybody can get these. John the Ripper, Hashcat, or ordinary desktop computer can test over 100 million passwords per second using password cracking tools running on a general purpose CPU. But these guys have powerful machines which can go through, many passwords very quickly, billions of passwords per second using a GPO-based password cracking tools, which has a CPU between 2 to 272 cores, mainly optimized for sequential serial processing. So they're using powerful machines to crack passwords and gain access quickly. GPUs are thousands of cores with thousands of threads of parallel processing. So they would invest a lot of money on their machines and systems in order to gain access to people's environment. Reasonably efficient, things are CUDA, OpenCL. You can see in the chart below, password safe, WPA, PSK, Bicrypt, SHA-514 crypt. So there's different things. Password length is, where they get you a lot. So, for example, if your password length is 4 characters, it would take these guys less than 1 second to crack your password. So if your password length is 5 character, still 1 second. If it's 6 characters, still 1 second. So as you can see, if currently if your password is 6 character, then you're in a serious trouble right now. So I would recommend change that as soon as possible. 7 characters is around 4 seconds. 8 characters is 1.5 minutes. 9 characters is 45 minutes, and 10 characters is about 19 hours, and 11 characters is 1 year, and 12 characters 1.5. So these are still doable. So 13 characters is about 40 years. Hopefully, you'll be working in the same job by then, so you won't be needing your password. So the safest place you can go right now is 13 to 14 characters. So just to protect yourself as much as, long passwords, one thing to note is very, very difficult to crack. Even supercomputers can't, it will take them forever. So longer the password is, difficult it is to crack. Password hygiene. What can you do to do a better hygiene? Just like, for example, I had as a growing up, I didn't take care of my teeth very well, and then had trouble with my tooth quite a bit as I grew up. So I had, in order to remediate that, I start brushing my teeth properly, flossing my teeth, and I did a great job, and everything got better. But so similarly, password hygiene, you can use password managers such as LastPass, 1Password, Bitwarden, and have you use 2-factor where possible, such as Duo. So that will give you another secondary level of authentication to make sure who you are, and no bad actors can misuse that. And there's a secondary level of verification. Do not share your credential with anybody. So if you say, you have important stuff in your system, and in general, you should never share your credential with anybody. So it's a bad practice. Have a cycle where passwords are required to be reset. So, change them, occasionally as much as possible. System administrators should disable LLMR and net bias in their local computer setting, or buy a group policy if they are not needing that in their environment. Phishing, you guys have probably heard about this, social engineering, where attacks to require personal information through an email manufactured to look like a legitimate email. An email looks like it's from a trusted parties such as bank, credit card company, IT administrator. It's an attempt to fool you into clicking it or do something with it. Or malicious link, which has some malicious software in it or attachment in it, where it can detonate and cause chaos in your environment. Phishing links manipulations, common for attacks to provide a link with slight modification to your URL subdomain intended to. So they change the names a little bit, like which you usually go to, like bankofamerica.com. They will say bankofamerica.example.com. So sometimes people don't pay attention and they'll accidentally click, and next thing you know, you're in bad shape. Edit the content of they also edit the content of HTML tag to make it look like it goes to a legit website, goes to a malicious, but instead it's going to a malicious website. Farming goes hand in hand with phishing. It redirects website traffic to a fake website, looks identical or very similar to a website the user intends to go to, and then they enter their username and password or other personal information, and then they capture that and they have it, the bad actors. Phishing, as you can see, is going more and more as we go, and there's a common way of attacking people. Email appeared to come from another college, for example, in our environment. User open attachment. College actually ran a diagnostic test, discovered a polymorphic virus embedded in the attachment. While the virus was in quarantine, it was too late to stop the infection, right? So it's already there. It's like if something is already in your body, sometimes it's hard to stop. So we're trying to do not get infections. So we are not in bad shape fighting towards it. So that's the basic idea. The college recently installed an the endpoint device to protect the server, but only portion of the system. The hacker set up URL, made fraudulent transfer of 800,000 and above from college. So so their hackers are stealing money and information using different techniques from various organizations. Email and browsing hygiene. Always keep in mind, does email directly relates to you that you're receiving? Is there something suspicious? Do not enter information on the website without HTTPS in the beginning and a lock a symbol. Communication is encrypted. That means personal information is entered, cannot be immediately viewed. So according to the word consortium, 60% of the website use an HTTPS protocol today. So Google, 71 of the world's top 100 use HTTPS. By the way, of emails imply urgency. Always look for suspiciously if somebody says, "Oh, change your password immediately." Look, your mailbox is out of space. There was a problem with your credit card. We have migrated to new environment. So whenever you see emails like this, just be very high alert that something could be suspicious about this. 70% of the business leaders are concerned about cybersecurity risks today. Data governance cyber are now the top concern according to Gartner. So the last thing which is important here is the ransomware, which you probably guys been hearing on the news. So I would like to talk about this a little bit more and stress why this is happening quite a bit and what is it. Ransom is a category of a malware that encrypts data on your computer or a system until ransom is paid to an attacker. Generally a specific amount is requested by the attacker or threat actors to encrypt the victim files. So it's encrypted, you cannot receive it. If you're, for example, you're in a hospital, they'll say, okay, you're in a surgery room, and they encrypt that data. You cannot use it you don't have the medical chart of the person, and you cannot access it, and the person might die because you don't know what the pre-existing conditions were and what type of surgery you need to perform and what type of things you need to look for. So they generally ask in terms of Bitcoin, decryption keys are provided to the victim to decrypt files, but they don't necessarily always provide those because they cannot be trusted. Even you have to pay a ransom, they may still not do it. So so it's better to take precautions not to get to that stage. Looking at some charts, in 2020, top 10 industry most targeted by attacks were hit by, as you can see, government agencies, banking, manufacturing, healthcare, finance, education. Every single industry was hit by ransomware. and it's getting pretty serious. So we have to be vigilant against these attackers to minimize damage. What is the financial impact of this? So ransomware cost is, the cost is costing billions for the last few years. And the projected cost for this year is $20 billion. The average cost per incident in 2020 was 8,000. I mean, this is, as like a small ransomware. So average increase of ransomware payment increased in Q4 by 104%. Average cost of ransomware attack in the in 2020 was 133,000. As you can see, the ransomware cost is increasing, every year. It's doubling, from 2019 to 2020. So I'm projecting it will be like almost to $28-29 billion this year too. So the question is, what can you do, or how does this ransomware targets your organization? It's important to understand, conceptualize these things, how these things are talking. So as I discuss about personal hygiene and steps you need to take to prevent against getting sick, or and prevent against some diseases. It's very important to understand that in terms of that. So think of a ransomware as a heart attack, I guess. So if you get a heart attack, you're in a what is that room called in the hospital, intensive care unit, where you're battling for your survival, right? So you're basically trying to bring yourself back to life, and then you have to figure that out. How do I do this? So how does this happen? How do these people give heart attack to an organization? So basically, the common ways is basically they send a phishing email, either has malicious document attached or redirect, and use it to a malicious website. So they do this through a manual propagation audit or an automated propagation. So there's a workflow associated with this, where you can understand descriptively how things are happening. Phishing emails intended intended for ransomware attacks usually contain a Microsoft document containing, some sort of a malicious macro or malicious program. When the user opens the file, the malicious macro is enabled. So as soon as you click or open it or do something, it will open. Then the macro then runs the script, which is downloads the malware's executable file. The file is installed on the computer's victim's computer and scans for files in the system, and eventually, encrypts the data. On the lower level, so as I mentioned, it has two ways of propagating. Once it's installed, the manual propagation, which means that the attacker, threat actor, having access to your environment with administrative privileges. Once this is achieved, they will perform the following. They will run file encryptor scripts on your system. These are commonly deployed using, your Microsoft policy GPOs or Windows batch files, or any vulnerable software on your system. Automated propagation means, certification or Windows token extraction from your system or RAM. And also utilizing Windows framework, for example, WMI, SMB communication to the server, messaging blocks, or PXEC, which is a way to connect to SMB to another machine to tie the executable payloads, or they take advantage of unpatched system, unpatched vulnerability, like such as the Eternal Blue, can be, be exploited. So, as you can see in the workflow here, so once you download infection rates from the phishing email, and supply chain, and then attacks is armed depending on the BIOS. Malware replaces the system files, master boot record, and the firmware is bypassed, and more exploits are installed. So basically, it's installing things at this point. Oh, sorry. And in infection is the next thing happens is credential theft, where malware begins to scan for internal system for other points of ingress, steal credentials, and creates more vectors for lateral movement across the network. So they're moving across the network and trying to steal stuff. And then the next one stage is malware attacks. Malware deploys final attack payload across the network. Payload will destroy files from the network, leaving only encrypted files and infected programs that perpetuate reactive payload. Once that has happened, attack is successful. Files on the system are encrypted with AES or other encryption, and victims are asked for ransomware, or usually on Bitcoin. As I mentioned, the payment is made. Encryption can be provided based on what type of actors you're dealing with. So, this is basically a flow, a high-level flow, how a malicious software compromises your system. So what are the common attack vectors? Other vectors they use is small, medium-sized companies are becoming target using RDP, which is remote desktop. So as RDP and VPN uses have been skyrocketed since Corona virus began. So more and more people working remotely. So large organizations are more likely to be targeted for phishing as opposed to RDP. So so they exploit that and try to take advantage of this. What are these type of ransomware that one sees? There's many different types, and there's always being new variants being added. So Sodinokibi, Maze, Phobos, Dharma, Ryuku, and more and more and more. So I can go through some of them just to give an idea of what they are and how they work. Sodinokibi is authored by the creator of Grab Ransomware, which was retired in summer of 2019. Basically, it basically sells phishing or a website link to a file, zip file. The file contains malicious JavaScript. Initially, access involves exploits of Oracle WebLogic vulnerability. Once that happens, script execution exploits verify the patch is installed. Script will not proceed if the patch is not found. Will run 32, 64-bit shellcode depending on the operating system architecture, and elevate Windows privileges, Windows APLC, which basically means an attacker who successfully exploited this vulnerability could run arbitrary code in the security context of the local system. An attacker could then install programs, or change delete or create new accounts with full user rights. To exploit this, vulnerability, attacker would first have to log on to the system, and the attacker could then, run a specially crafted application that could exploit the vulnerability and take control of the affected system. So this is, ALPC. So sign of compromise infected system will have ransomware notes on the desktop that appears, as in the notepad, and the infected targeted files are JPEG, raw, stuff like that. So ransomware note. So after the victim opens the malicious zip, so it runs in the background and changes the wallpaper to blue along with the opening a ransom note via notepad. The note explains the system files have been encrypted and instructions are provided to unlock files. These involves going to a specific website and copy a provided key. So in what is the encrypted files looks like. So as you can see, they're all encrypted. Then you have a payment page. The victim is provided to a link again to a page in the ransom node. They have to enter a generic key to the node, access the paywall. Once to perform the required step to make the payment, encryption keys are intended to be available. But you can't trust these guys. They're bad people. They may not give it to you. So it could be an example again, software as sold as RAS, ransomware as a service. Basically, that means that some people have malicious software, but they don't have a network. So other bad guys, so they gang up with other bad guys who have access to a certain network, but they don't have a malicious program. So they, work with them to, split, the money they made through exploitation, 70-30 or 50-50, depending on what the deal is. So these guys work sometimes in teams. So Dharma, again, is another ransomware. It's basically leak or weak Windows credentials, open RDP protocol 3389, phishing emails, malicious attachments, sign of compromise, .dharma, crisis, so many, .funny. I mean, they have all sorts of weird file extensions, so known hashes, if you see these hashes, then you're in trouble. Ransomware notes, again, README file, how to encrypt, decrypt your data, decryption instruction, file encrypted, file to be encrypted, stuff like that. So as you can see, RDP compromise was on the rise, email phishing on the rise, Doppler payment is another similar code. Is basically downloadable temporary files, primarily found on a cryptocurrency website. Use CV vulnerability as an entry point, and then executes, verifies for a patch. If it's not there, then again, ransomware note will appear. Known file paths are, some of these things are known, and their notes again look very similar. They lock the files, then the encrypted file looks like this, and then they give you the payment page, how to pay and stuff like that. So why is RDP important? As I mentioned, remote desktop. It was developed by Microsoft in 90s as a part of the Windows NT platform, enables you end user to access computer from another location. If left open to internet, a hacker can gain access to a remote server. Attackers often scan for open port 33889, which is a very well-known common technique. So how do they breach through RDP? Attacker will run a port scan using Shodan, looking for open TCP port, and then brute force attack credentials. Leaked credentials can be purchased through a website. The use of phishing to gain access inside on an organization once an attacker is, there can brute force attack, excuse me, somebody sent me a note here. I just want to check. Looking for. So the use of credentials can gain access to organization once it attacks brute force internal RDP access through a compromised device. So, all right, so I went through that. Okay, what happens? So the attacker will use Mimikatz to harvest your Windows credentials with an administrator account. The threat actor will elevate your privileges within the domain. Once the network, the attacker will attempt to map out topography. Organizations should consider secure best practices, reputation of third-party managed services. Threat actors often use MSPs, an objective for accessing client networks. They can also create spoof emails, compromise account belonging to MSP. So what are the best practices one can do on RDP to protect against malware, ransomware? Enforce strong AD password, administrative policy. This will make cracking obtained hashes more difficult, will prevent direct access to the campus resources should an attacker gain access to your network. Domain accounts should be restricted, should not be used to administrative level systems. and password theft, which I already discussed, data dictionary attacks, brute force attack, rule attacks. In Windows GPOs, group policy. Group policy can be used to create security policy across the network. The CCC information has a security lab that can assist in your in your group policy, which Larry has a talk later on. He's going to go into this in depth, and he will showcase you how you can use this. Restrict RDP access through campus network only. Access Windows machine should only be done through campus. Outside access should only be allowed through a VPN connection to your campus. Ensure monitoring of your RDP systems. So, just make sure you do those at basic level. Two-factor authentication, again, giving access when giving access to VPN, RD gateways can be configured to integrate with campus instance of Duo or anything else you're using. Only provide Windows RDP access to user who require it. All Windows AD administrators can log via remote desktop by default. Default settings should be changed. Remote access for domain accounts should be limited only who strictly require it. If RDP is necessary for the system, you should remove all administrative level access through RDP and restrict it to some sort of user account only. If the system requires RDP access, please only allow via VPN or two-factor or something like that. Enable network level authentication to authenticate themselves against when you're establishing a session. If RDP is required, then this should be enabled. Prevent phishing. Again, staff should be trained to identify phishing emails, avoid downloading attachment from a malicious, untrustworthy links. Again, keep in mind, does the email relate to what are you doing? When you see change your password immediately, your mailbox is full, or something like that, you have to be very mindful of the fact this could be a malicious email. Cyber hygiene tips for preventing ransomware attacks. So basically is prevent phishing, disable macros, enforce strong password, consistently monitor network traffic, monitor Windows and back up your asset often, patch your systems, implement RDP best practices. So there's a number of things that you need to do to avoid some sort of a heart attack, as I mentioned. As you can see, certain websites don't have the lock, SSL certs. So make sure you are, look at the lock, make sure it has a SSL cert. And some of these, fraudsters sometimes say, spell Amazon with 2 N's to trick you into logging into thinking that you're logging to Amazon, but they're really stealing your credentials and user ID. Some of this, as you can see, has a lock, it's verified by Google. This one doesn't. So the website doesn't have supply identity of this information, right? So disable macros office. Macros are command that helps automate tasks. So they can be abused to perform exploit on your system. Unless your organization require macros, it's strongly recommend for O365 admins to disable their use of enforce strong password policy. Same as concept RDP, a strong policy will make cracking tool obtained very, very difficult. This will make access to Windows account more difficult for attackers. Backup important assets as often as possible. It's recommended to keep a backup copy in the cloud. On-premise backups can be infected. Consistently monitor traffic, discover unusual traffic, and so that can help you out. Monitor network play and packet analysis, monitor Windows events, regularly patch a system, because patching vulnerability is one of the main areas these guys attack. Run vulnerability scan on your network and detect vulnerability and use Tenable or something like that to get alerts and stuff like that. Develop a comprehensive network diagram. So know where your system are, routers, switches, and stuff like that. And if you know, where everything is, it will help you do the incident response and do things effectively. Restrict PowerShell usage is a tool automating tasks, performing AD, Windows AD directory. Restrict usage of PowerShell via group policy and should only be available system admin. Enable transcription module and script block logging. Segment your traffic. Physical logic segment can prevent you from, it can help you impact intrusion, limit lateral movement by these bad actors. Analyze network traffic, as I mentioned. Secure domain controllers, again, how, recommend the latest version of Windows servers and ensure unnecessary software not installed there. Kerberos default is recommended for authentication. Kerberos not used. Enable NTLM is to ensure that only NTLM version 2 responses are being sent across the network. If possible, refuse LM and NTLM responses. What do you do if you are infected? Although it is unusual to shut down an infected system, the best action is to keep it turned on and isolate the system from your network. This is to dump RAM memory for analysis. There may be a chance for reaching out cryptographic keys in the RAM memory. This also protect evidence and ransomware encryption keys. So we also do some sort of phishing services. Common finding, we do a lot of pen tests. So we saw a lot of unpatched systems, remote code execution, deserialization attacks on WebLogic servers, weak passwords on Windows domains, domain admins, too many domains logged into a high-risk system, used inappropriately. LLMR is enabled. WPAD is, inappropriately configured, which WPAD is outbound proxy misconfiguration let someone steal credentials. So stuff like that. I'm sorry, I've gone a little bit far or by time a little bit, but I'm just trying to go quickly. So we do offer different services. Go to our website and check it out, and prevent yourself as much as possible. Let's see. I am gonna answer the chat questions as people go on breaks. I apologize, I've gone over my time, but I just wanted to, have a few minutes here. Let's see if I have any question. Is there a way on effort security working on a standardized GitHub? So David, I got your question. Larry is going to be doing some presentation on this. So he'll going to go in depth in this question. I'm going to have him please attend his talk. Yes, there were the presentations available to after the workshop. We are recording this. We will also be providing links for that in a few days, I guess. So you can use this. All the material is available, and just please be careful from ransomware. It's been creating lots of chaos around, and we are going to be the last talk today is very, very important by Larry Soto on ransomware prevention technique. What I did was I just gave an overview of what ransomware is, how attackers gain access, and what are the various techniques they use. So just to give people overview of this thing. So okay, thank you very much.